Thank you, and welcome to everybody. Nice to be with you this afternoon. We're here to look this afternoon at GCSE Spanish, and we're looking specifically at a training event which is aimed at ensuring that you can mark and assess to the same standard that we would expect our examiners to mark and assess to. So we're looking at this Get Exam Fit for GCSE Spanish Paper 4. And today's event is focused on the crossover question. It's about foundation tier question 3 or higher tier question 1. And of course, we're still talking about the 2016 specification. It sounds a long time ago now, doesn't it? 2016. So our events for the new incoming specifications, which you will have started to teach, of course, will come online, from next year. But at the moment, we're looking at getting students ready for the final series of this 2016 exam, which will be, of course, next summer. So I suppose I should just very briefly as well introduce myself. I'm Tim Guilford. I'm one of the trainers and consultants who work for Pearson, delivering all sorts of events to do with languages. And I've also got a lot of years experience as an examiner, senior examiner, and chair of examiners as well. So hopefully we can sort of add some value to the things that we say this afternoon. Now, we've got a sort of reasonable number of people with us this afternoon, potentially sort of around about 40 people, depending on whether people join. So I'm going to say to you, it's absolutely fine to type into the chat and so on, but I'll monitor that. I'll have a look at that at certain points as we go along, unless I specifically just ask you to put something in there. So please don't think I'm ignoring your question or your query or your comment. It just obviously, as we're presenting the event, I'd quite like to sort of present, and then I'll kind of come to the chat and we'll try and clear up your queries. If you do have any specific queries or questions as well, we'll make sure that there's some time at the end for me to deal with those. So it may be just something that you would like to sort of jot down, and then we can kind of deal with it at the end of the session. Okay, so looking then at the objectives for today, we're going to look at understanding the mark schemes in detail first of all. So that's our starting point, is making sure that you're familiar with the mark scheme. Some people, although the specification is ending, this will be your first year teaching and assessing GCSE. So we'll make sure that the things we say about the mark schemes are clear. And I'll also say to you, of course, that much of what we say will also apply to the new specification going forward, but more of that in future events. So we're going to have a look at the mark schemes. We're going to then think about what those look like in context. So we're going to get you to have a look at some marked scripts and the examiner commentaries so that you understand the context. So first of all, big picture with the mark scheme, then we're going to put that into context and provide you with some hopefully useful insight into the marking. And then it's kind of over to you. So then we're going to get you to do some blind trial marking, just to sort of confirm your understanding and also just to try and standardize the approaches. And so it's a sort of condensed version of what we might do as senior examiners with our examining teams. Some of you may be examiners and may be familiar with that, but that's kind of the approach. So we get you to have a go. Obviously, when we do the blind trial marking, it's not a test, so please don't be shy if we ask you to put your marks in the chat or that sort of thing. It's really just about making sure that you can assess accurately and fairly, because that informs all sorts of choices that you need to make about your students, of course, in terms of tier of entry, and also kind of enables you to see their progress and track and monitor their progress as they go from where they are now through to the final exam in May, June time in 2025. And then the final sort of bit really is we're going to sort of not just make it a kind of post-mortem event where all we do is look at candidate work that is marked already where the mark is definitive, but we're also going to give a little bit of thought to how you might, if you had those students who produced those things in mock exams, what kind of targeted feedback, developmental feedback you could give to those students. So it's sort of understanding the marking scheme, doing some marking, but also looking at the context of it. And so what could you usefully say to those students? How would you move the dial a little bit on the mark if you had students who produced those things? So I'm going to sort of begin really by talking to you a little bit in sort of general terms about how we use mark schemes. Now, one of the key features really of Pearson qualifications is that we have a what we would call a positive marking approach. So we always look to give marks, and we never look to withhold marks. And by that, I mean, quite often during the course of these events, teachers will say, you know, are they penalised for? Do Pearson penalise them if? And I think it's a good thing just to say that we never penalise as such. What we do is if the quality of the work is presented, we give the marks, and we seek to mark positively. And if we can justify giving the marks and giving the marks fairly, we will always aim to do that. And I think that's an important principle, because you are sort of in a situation as a teacher in a classroom where a lot of the marking you do, even if it's marking a mock exam or a sort of a test piece, has got a sort of formative element. It's got something where you're looking at it to find the problems, find the holes in it, and to help your students improve. But actually, when we mark as examiners, our outcome is entirely summative. So in fact, all we're interested in is the final mark. There is, I mean, the exam is the end, isn't it? So there is no opportunity for improvement or feedback. That's that snapshot. So I think that is useful just for yourselves to bear in mind as teachers when you are marking work that students have done. If you're attaching the mark to it, you can do it first of all as a summative mark. So, you know, this is the mark. This is where we fit you, and we've marked as positively as we possibly can. And then look at the sort of formative element separately, and perhaps as a sort of secondary thing. So I think it's kind of important just to remember that, you know, the teacher hat and the examiner hat is those are slightly different hats, and those are slightly different approaches. Okay, now one thing as well that I think we need to say, and this is really the kind of message of this particular slide, is that this particular question is marked on 2 mark grids, one for communication and content and another one for linguistic knowledge and accuracy, 1 out of 12 marks, 1 out of 8 marks. And within the boxes in those grids, there are descriptors. And again, it's important to understand that examiners are not looking for every element of those descriptors to be completely visible in order to locate the candidate's mark in that box. So what we do is we apply what we would call a best fit approach. So it's best fit and not exact match. So there may be, and we'll have a look in a moment or two at the marking grids, there may be opportunities to give a candidate sometimes a better mark. But if you're looking in too much detail at the exact wording of the box, you think, well, actually, I'm not sure whether they exactly do that particular thing. That doesn't mean that the candidate can't have a mark in that box. So that's a best fit descriptor rather than an exact match. Now, it's useful as well as you're looking at the mark schemes to have a look at how they vary across the mark boxes. So we might have, for the highest mark bands, it will say always or consistently, and then a little bit lower down it says frequently, and then at a lower mark again sometimes, and then maybe rarely. So sometimes it's those qualifying words that are the best places to start. So keep that seesaw and that idea of the best fit in mind as we go through the event today, and as we get you to do some training, because I think it's a useful. Could I comfortably live with it being in that box, rather than does the piece of work exactly match every bit of the wording of those criteria? So we're going to have a look now. We're going to begin by looking at the question. We're going to look at the task, and then we'll look at the mark schemes, and then we're going to get you to have a look at some candidate work. Okay, so we're looking, as we mentioned, at this crossover question, foundation tier question 3 and higher tier question 1. There are some things that we might say about this in terms of what we could expect in terms of candidate performance, because and you will know this as teachers, that if you've got foundation tier candidates, this effectively this is as far as they can go. This is almost the pinnacle of their performance. If you've got higher tier candidates, we may see considerably better performance from our more able higher tier candidates. And I think it's important to understand that this is a crossover task. And so this is a task that is really located within the range of grades that are available at the top end of foundation and at the lower end of higher. So on a higher tier candidate who does this crossover question, there may actually be headroom within the marking. It's absolutely possible that a higher tier candidate, fairly good higher tier candidate, gets full marks on that particular task, because this particular crossover question isn't where the differentiation happens for that candidate. It will happen in the longer writing task, or possibly in the translation. But because it's a crossover question, we need to just be making sure that we are applying the same criteria across foundation and higher tier. And again, it's a thing that examiners will do a lot of work on. And we do see different patterns sometimes in the kind of work that a candidate will produce, sometimes also reflective of the tier of entry generally, that if we've got a weak higher tier candidate, there will be perhaps attempts at greater sophistication, although not necessarily carried off, whereas a foundation tier candidate may be very solid and reliable, but the expression is simpler. But both of those may fit into the same mark box. Okay, so just to remind those of you who've taught it lots of times before, and also just to explain to people who may be newly teaching this qualification for the first and last time this year. Question 3 on foundation, question 1 on higher. They are exactly the same question. So here we see the examples of kind of what it is we might be going to see. The candidates need to choose question 3A or 3B. So make sure that they've understood the task. This is an informal writing task, and you can see that como es tu ciudad and lo que hiciste la semana. So it's an informal task. It's writing a letter or an email to a friend. Could be a blog post. There are 4 bullet points in each task, and there's a recommended word count. And we'll say a little bit more about those things in a moment. And of course, 20 marks, and we'll look at how those marks are allocated. Okay, so the candidates have to, first thing they need to do is to choose. And, they really need to choose carefully, not choose always on the basis of the title, because sometimes this will happen, and then they get to bullet point 3 and they're starting to struggle because they can't think of what their opinion about public transport is because maybe they live in a more rural idea. And so we do need to make sure that candidates read both questions and choose carefully, and they need to make sure that they can answer all 4 of those bullet points, because that's a part of the task. So if we look at the task in detail then, so let's have a look at the first task. So just read you through. It says, escribe un email a tu amigo Pablo. Debes mencionar los siguientes puntos. Las excursiones que organiza tu colegio. Una excursión que hiciste el año pasado. Tu opinión sobre visitar museos. ¿A dónde vas a ir en el futuro? And then escribe aproximadamente 80 a 90 palabras en español. So what are they told? Okay, so the candidates are given the topic, and so we're told what it is you're going to need to write about. So first of all, that use of that title should activate some vocabulary knowledge in their minds. They should be thinking, do I have the vocabulary to write about school trips? And then they're given the format of the task. So here it's an email, could be a letter, could be a blog, whatever it is. Now, sometimes teachers will ask, do they need to write dear something, hello, Pablo? Do we have to do that? Do we have to put un saludo or something at the end? And the answer is no. We're interested in the content rather than the format. So if they'd like to, they can absolutely do that, but we don't particularly need them to do anything that is not part of the bullet points. And I think that again is quite important, because sometimes it's fine if they write hola Pablo, that's okay. Hola Pablo, ¿qué tal? It's okay. But actually what you're doing, if you're not careful, is you're using up, 4 or 5, 6 of your 80 to 90 words on something that's not part of the task. So best advice really is keep that absolutely minimal at the start and at the end. And we do sometimes see candidates who will write 2 or 3 lines of kind of, hello, Pablo, and how were your holidays and this sort of thing. And, is your mum better from the, whatever it is that they've kind of learned or think that they can write. And that's not helpful, because obviously what we need them to do is to respond to the task. So they're given that format of the task, but with those provisos that I just mentioned. So then they're asked to give information in the present. They're asked to give information in the past. They're asked to give a justified opinion. And they're asked to express a future expectation. Okay, so past, present, future, justified opinion. Those things don't necessarily always go in that order. So again, important to train your students to look out for the non-present time frames. And what we do always do is we support those with a word or a short phrase that kind of supports that time frame. So, una excursión que hiciste en el pasado. So it isn't just una excursión que hiciste. We don't expect the student to recognize the verb form to identify the requirement of the bullet point. And you know, ¿a dónde vas a ir en el futuro? So they're given en el futuro, and not just ¿a dónde vas a ir? Again, this is kind of part and parcel of making sure that the students do what they are required to do. Okay, so just again, have a look through past papers, and you will see those formulations, if you like, of past and future. And you know, it might be recientemente, and it again would be a kind of a support of the idea that that is a past tense requirement, past time frame requirement. Okay. I suppose it's also worth just mentioning to you, and I'm sure you know really, but that the future expectation, what we would count as a future time frame is just talking about anything that hasn't happened yet. And so it can include, you know, the straightforward future tense. It can include that periphrastic future vas a ir, or that future with ir, and also conditional as well. You know, a dónde te gustaría ir en el futuro is absolutely acceptable for what we would consider a future time frame. So I think just to kind of mention that, and that the candidates have got sort of options there, and that formulation will appear in the question sometimes. And then they're told to write about 80 to 90 words in Spanish. Now, again, one of the questions that will occur sometimes is, you know, what if they do too much, or what if they don't write enough? Well, first of all, sort of to reassure you and to reassure your students, everything they write will be marked. And we do have candidates sometimes who will write 150 or 200 words in response to this, and sometimes this is okay. But usually what I can say is that, and some of my long experience as an examiner, is that when the answer is too long or too short, it tends to be slightly self-penalizing, really. You know, if they write too little, they perhaps haven't covered and developed each of the 4 bullet points as much as they need to. And I mean, let's face it, we're 80 to 90, we're only talking about 20 words or so about each bullet point. So it's quite short already, really, when you look at it. You know, it's 2-3 sentences, 3 sentences at the most, isn't it? But sometimes even just one longish sentence will reach that 20 word count. If they write too little, then quite often they don't cover the content they need to do. Sometimes they've missed a bullet point out. Sometimes also they haven't covered the range of language that they need to sufficiently to kind of move themselves up the mark scheme. Because if you think as well, we'll have a look at the mark schemes in a moment, but we are looking for things like robust demonstration that you can use past time frames. So just saying fui once is not really demonstrating to an examiner that you can even in a simple way use that past time frame. But when we've had, you know, 2-3 different verbs, maybe some different persons of the verb, maybe we've had a reflexive or a sort of a regular and an irregular one, and a little bit of variation, a little bit of variety, then that is better demonstrated. So conversely, candidate who writes far too much will quite often ramble away from the point. And I think we start talking about, you know, your opinion about visiting museums. We just want to know your opinion about visiting museums, but we don't then need to talk about whether you also like shopping centres or sports, watching football at a stadium and this kind of thing. So sometimes, you know, in an effort to kind of show that they can do lots, they will put down almost everything that they can possibly think of. And again, that's not helpful, because the content stops being completely relevant, it stops being completely coherent. And again, the more they write, the more errors they're likely to make. And I think time management in this particular task is really important, particularly, funnily enough, for those foundation tier candidates who are sort of ambitious for their grade 4, grade 5, possibly. They want to do really well with this task, but actually sometimes they're working a bit at the limits of the Spanish that they've got. So they need to allow themselves a bit of time to plan, some time to write, and then also some time to check through carefully at the end that everything that they've written is coherent. And I think the overall coherence is an important factor, and I'll talk to you a bit about that in a moment when we have a look at the mark schemes. But part of what makes a really good outcome for a task like this is that it's nice and straightforward, but you as the person reading it are hardly having to do any work at all. You don't need to try and work out what the candidate's talking about, what they mean, and you don't have to, in terms of the content, and then in terms of the language, not trying to untangle tangled grammar. So the less work you're doing as an examiner, the better the likely outcome of the task is. Other thing that I suppose sometimes teachers would like to know is whether they're allowed to use the words that appear on the in the bullet points. And yes, that's absolutely fine. But just be very careful that they understand that those are given in the second person singular. So the hiciste and vas a ir, so they've got to change those things to hice and voy a if they need to do that in order to write. But of course, that's with some of particularly the foundation tier candidates, that little manipulation is one that's really useful to maybe work on with students, because we don't use a huge range of verbs there, but it is important that they try to, if they use some of those words, they make sure that they manipulate the verb so that we've got the correct person and that everything is clear. And I think the final thing, which is a sort of overarching thing that I want to say, is about task completion here. It really matters that the candidates answer all of those 4 bullet points if they are to stand a chance of getting into the top mark boxes, because you miss out that bullet point about where you're going to go in the future, you definitely haven't shown your ability to talk about past, present, and future events. You haven't demonstrated that robustly. So you're definitely not going to be in the 7 or 8 box for linguistic knowledge and accuracy. You may not even get sort of into the 5, 6 box. And again, you're certainly not going to be in the 10 to 12 box for communication and content either. So they need to talk about all 4 bullet points. There's no absolute requirement that those are dealt with equally and evenly, but we are kind of looking for a consistent outcome. So it's kind of good advice that they aim to do that. And I suppose just the final thing to say about the 80 to 90 words is that don't particularly encourage your candidates to count the words or do anything, spend any time doing anything like that, because sometimes we find that they will have been encouraged to count and they've discovered that it was 120 and they decide to cross some out. And in crossing some out, they've crossed out, the verb or something kind of essential to the sentence, so that the overall quality has a sort of, there's a detrimental effect on that. But it's good practice, of course, for candidates to think, well, that's each one of those bullet points is about 3 lines in my handwriting on exam paper, and for them just to sort of know that's kind of enough. So everything that they write will be marked. So moving on now, and just want to have a look at the mark schemes. And so we're just going to remind you of some of the wording, and then we'll have a look in particular at the sort of top end of the mark scheme, and have a look at what some of those things mean. So for this particular task, there are 2 mark grids. There are 12 marks available for communication and content, and they are exactly the same mark grids for question 1 at higher. This particular example comes from the question 3, but the wording is exactly the same. The level is exactly the same. The requirement is exactly the same for the question 1 at higher. So the communication and content mark grid is about whether they've communicated information relevant to the task, whether they've expanded their ideas, developed their ideas. And again, you know, development, keep in mind, we're only looking for 80 to 90 words. Whether we've seen effective adaptation of language to narrate, inform, interest, give convincing personal opinions. We're looking for frequent examples of creative language to express individual thoughts and ideas, variety of vocabulary and expression, and some examples of uncommon language. We'll unpick all these things in a moment, and appropriate use of register and style throughout. On the other side, on the right-hand side, we've got the linguistic knowledge and accuracy mark grid. Notice that there are more marks, far more marks for communication and content than there are for linguistic knowledge and accuracy. So this is reflective of the fact that this is the crossover task. We're still really mainly interested in communication, and linguistic knowledge and accuracy doesn't score quite so highly. And this is somewhat less the case as we look at for example, the higher tier question 2, which some of you may join us for the event for that. I think in a week and a bit. But for 7 and 8 marks for linguistic knowledge and accuracy, we've got some variation of grammatical structures, occasional complex structure, frequently extended sentences well linked together, generally accurate language and structures, and so on. And it says including successful references to past, present, and future events. Occasionally errors hinder the clarity of communication. So keep in mind what I said about, you know, following those 4 bullet points, making sure that they stick to those 4 bullet points and going from there. Now, when I do work with examiners, when we train examiners, sometimes, and you may or may not find this helpful, but I find it quite helpful to sort of attach a name to each of those 4 boxes. We'll have a look in a moment, but because the first step always with marking, and you'll see this in the Pearson specification, in the published mark schemes, it says find the band, choose the band. So we need to choose the band, and then within the band we're choosing the mark. So for example, if we've in that communication and content, we think, well, actually it's somewhere in that 7 to 9 band, and this is where the best fit comes into play. So if you think it's probably in there, but actually, you know, there are elements of 4 to 6 in there. That will pull it towards the 7. If you think there are more elements of the 10 to 12, it will pull it towards the 9. So that's what we mean by the best fit. But the first thing you need to do, of course, is to identify the band. Now, you can call them what you like. We are at this point in this particular crossover task where we're not really talking about anything excellent or outstanding in terms of their use of Spanish. So at this point, for foundation, to the top end of foundation tier, the candidates are quite good. So sometimes I find it's helpful if you're that 10 to 12 or 7 to 8, you say, well, yeah, that's quite good. That's quite good for you know, the level we're talking about, that's quite good. 7 to 9, you might want to call it reasonable. 4 to 6, you could say it's simple, but you know, does it, but it's you know, quite straightforward really, and then maybe limited in the 1 to 2. So if as a teacher, I find sometimes people find that helpful, sometimes they don't. You could you can call them whatever word you would like to call them, but I think sometimes it is quite a useful thing to do because it's also gives you a sort of almost a sort of shorthand for finding the mark box and then deciding within that mark box, whether it's quite good, but it sort of tends towards the reasonable and so on and so forth. So it's just a sort of an additional idea if you find that helpful. Now, if we just have a look at the two mark boxes now, we're going to have a look at the sort of the top really of the communication and content, and then in a moment at the top of the linguistic knowledge and accuracy mark box. I'm just going to give you a moment or two. We'll read it through, but I just want you to have a little bit of a think about what you mean, what we mean by what you understand by those things in the blue box. So for 10 to 12 marks, we're told for communication and content, the candidate communicates information relevant to the task with expansion of key points and ideas. There is effective adaptation of language to narrate, inform, interest, and give convincing personal opinions. There are frequent examples of creative language to express individual thoughts and ideas, a variety of vocabulary and expression, some examples of uncommon language. And finally, appropriate use of register and style throughout with minimal inconsistency. Overall, that gives a quite good piece of Spanish. And overall, of course, we're looking for that sort of coherence about how hard is, and keep this in mind when we do a bit of marking in a minute, how difficult, how much work are you needing to do to understand? But can I just give you a moment or two just to sort of reflect on, and just if there are any that you think I'm not sure what that means, that's also useful. So, what do you understand by relevant and expansion, key points, key ideas, adaptation of language, narrate, inform, interest, convincing opinions, creative, individual thoughts, variety of vocabulary, uncommon language, register, and style? So I'll just give you a moment before I start to talk again, just to have a look at, are there any of those that you sort of think are, I don't really know what that means, and that might be something that you want to just kind of think about when we come back together. So I'll just go quiet for a moment, and then we'll unpick what some of those things actually mean. Right, so let's just have a bit of a think about kind of what it might, and this is sometimes a useful thing to do with some work from your own students, just to have a look through and are we seeing, what evidence are we seeing of those things? So first of all, is it relevant? So the bullet point provides the reference point, and so is everything they say in response to that bullet point, and also everything they say overall relevant to the task. Have we stayed on task? So is everything relevant? We're looking for a bit of expansion as well. So expansion can be, sometimes it's giving a list. It's making sure that we haven't just said one particular thing, but perhaps a list is not quite enough to give expansion. If we look at those tasks that we saw earlier on, we have the thing about school trips, for example, what kind of school trips? So a list of different school trips is one thing, but actually a student who says you know, we go to museums, we go to galleries, we go to the theatre, we're getting a lot of the same thing. But you know, with my history class, we went to a museum, you know, and then you're starting to get the expansion. You're getting a little bit more information. Key points, we've got key ideas. Adaptation of language. What does adaptation of language mean? Well, perhaps, for example, that we're using some different persons of the verb as well. So it isn't just all I or we, you know, but we're getting some of those things happening as well. That we're getting some of our sentences more connected with not just with and but maybe although and this kind of thing, so that we're seeing that kind of adaptation of language. The narrate, particularly for that past tense, what you did, that past tense is, you know, it's an opportunity to tell a little story. So when they narrate, you know, they say, last week we went to, and it was, and my friend did such and so. That again, we're getting, if we can, that sort of variety of language coming through. Inform, yes, we're talking about the kind of, that first bullet point is all about information. Interest as well, and this kind of idea of having something a little bit unusual in terms of the content is also very good, something that kind of interests the reader. So, well, actually, as you look at some of your students, what you thought, actually, this is the content is a bit pedestrian, you might think. And so how could we just encourage students to just include some more interesting ideas? Are we getting convincing opinions? You know, I like it because it's nice is a very simple opinion and justification. But I like it because it's something I always wanted to do, is something that gives you a much more convincing kind of approach to the opinion. So again, you know, are the opinions convincing? Have we got that sort of use of creative language there? And sometimes with that future tense one, that's an opportunity to do something a little bit, not wild, but just something a little bit imaginative, unusual. We've got individual thoughts. Look also at the variety of vocabulary, because again, that variety of vocabulary and uncommon language are something that are quite interesting areas really to work on and develop. And sometimes it's to do with the fact that they kind of leap to the most obvious thing. So everybody has to play football in the park, but actually, if you did something else somewhere else, you could actually add to the interest of the piece. It could become a bit more creative, and then you'd also move into different areas of vocabulary and that sort of uncommon language. And I'm only talking about the sort of things that come up a lot. You know, it's sort of things you do at the weekend and food you eat and sort of free time activities. And, you know, if they're talking about clubs they're in at school, actually, it doesn't always need to be a sport. You know, if we can find something else that's a little bit unusual, that will sometimes take them into a different domain. And again, as they talk about holidays, quite often we get a lot of, you know, swimming in the sea and sitting on the beach. But actually, if they sort of can manage to deal with something like a mountain holiday or that kind of city break or shopping in a city, that sort of thing, again, sometimes that will take them into that sort of domain of uncommon language. So we're not setting the bar massively high for that, but it is something worth thinking about. And then also, is the register and style correct? So we're looking for a sort of informal kind of email, letter, blog post, whatever it is, but it's written for an audience of a similar age to the majority of the candidates. Okay. Keep in mind, as I said, as you do the marking in a moment or two, that what we're interested in, I think, is the idea of how coherent it is overall in answer to the bullet points, and also that am I having to work a bit hard now to read? You know, am I having to put a bit of effort into, or does it read well? And now we have a look at our linguistic knowledge and accuracy. So again, sort of in terms of aiming high, the 7 to 8 mark band says some variation of grammatical structures, occasional complex language, produces frequently extended sentences well linked together, generally accurate language and structures, including successful references to past, present, and future events. Occasionally errors occur that hinder clarity of communication. So again, what do we mean by those things? So grammatical structures, have we got that variation so that we haven't always got the same one or two structures? And some of those things are grammatical structures. Some of them are also about teaching your students some organizer vocabulary, perhaps, you know, no solo and sino, and primero and después, and things like that, that again can be quite nice for sort of developing the level of language. So they don't need a huge repertoire of them, but some of those things that show linguistic control. Have we got some complex language? And the specification talks about complex language. Again, making sure that that complex language, if they've decided they want to use a subjunctive in a little phrase that you've taught them, that's fine, but just make sure that, you know, it makes sense, but that kind of thing. And also some of those more kind of conceptually challenging sort of tenses, tense formations, and so on. Sometimes they will want to have a go at that, but keep in mind we are at that sort of crossover stage, so we're not looking for huge levels of complexity, but just the hint being there. Quite often it comes with organizers, you know, primero and luego and después and things like that. Can be really useful, for example, when you're doing the narration part in the past tense. So we're looking for sentences that are well linked together. The language is well linked. We're looking for accuracy. Past references, present references, and future references. Notice the sort of plural there as well. So I think, you know, to be confident for that 7 to 8 mark box that we could apply that to past, present, and future references, we need to see a little bit of variety in those past references. And that can be that they've used a regular verb, an irregular verb, and a reflexive, or that they've used, you know, 3 different, or that they've used a couple of different, 2 different persons of the verb, and so on. So that kind of is something that, again, it's there is that sort of linguistic control, but they're not. We're then confident in a way as examiners that these are not just memorized things. You know, sometimes we will see quite a convincing looking sequence of writing dealing with the past tense bullet point, but actually all the candidate says is fui 6 times and then comí or something, and so we're actually not kind of seeing that sort of convincing use of those references. Errors, well, look, errors occur that occasionally errors occur that hinder clarity and the clarity of communication. So there is sort of a difference between a minor error, which is one that you can, things like you know, putting el instead of la. Nobody died, did they? When they do that, it jars slightly as a teacher, as a person reading it, but actually the communication is carried well. So those not quite so concerned about for this task, but it's sometimes those errors that hinder the clarity. Those are the bits where I talk about how hard do you have to work to read it, and with the linguistic knowledge and accuracy, if you're looking at it and you think, oh no, I need to, so I'm kind of stopping here. This is sort of blocking the flow of the language because I'm not quite sure what the subject of the verb is, or I'm not quite clear what the ending is here. I'm not quite clear, you know, or we've got sort of things like, you know, instead of hace calor, está calor, or something like this, that well, actually, all of that will kind of hinder the clarity. It's an error that hinders the clarity of communication and becomes a more major error. But keep in mind that we're not looking for perfection here. So it's, you know, some variation of grammatical structures, occasional complex structure, extended sentences, you know, some errors occasionally hinder clarity of communication. So it doesn't need to be perfect. And that fits with what I sort of said about, you know, if you kind of attach the word quite good, it's quite good to that mark box, that can be quite helpful because it enables you, and sort of when you get into marking the higher tier longer writing passages, we would go from quite good to generally good and excellent. You know, we could add some descriptors on the top of that, but more of that next time if you join for the higher tier longer writing task event. Okay, now what I'm going to do now is we're going to get you to do a little bit of marking. You'd be pleased to know that you don't need to listen to me for the next 15 minutes or so. We're going to give you some time just to have a look in the resource pack, and you should find the resource pack in the downloads. I think there's a link in the chat. In the resources area, if you've got a resources tab, you should find that. And if you don't have a resources tab, go onto the more button and have a look down, and you should find should say resources. If you click there on that where it says resources, and then when you go into it, the middle tab documents, and you'll be able to download the documents from there. It's probably worth doing that if you can do that now and have them and save them. But what we want you to do in any case is to have a look at the two marked scripts. That's exemplars 1 and 2 at the moment, and we're going to then get you just to relate them back to the mark scheme document, the mark scheme documents there as well. And just have a look through in the light of the things that we've talked about so far and see, you know, are you comfortable with that mark? Do you understand that mark? And there is, in those two exemplars, you will see the commentary from the principal examiner as well. So there's the explanation is given. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking now. We'll give you 15 minutes. So it's 4:55 now. So if we come back at 5:10, and then we'll have a look at any kind of matters arising from that. Okay, so I'll see you at 5:10. Okay, so we'll come back together now, and hopefully people have had an opportunity to have a look through those first two exemplars individually, and look at the approach to marking. So I'm going to, I'll just sort of open up the chat now. Can I just sort of ask you just to say in the chat, did what you saw make sense now in the context of what I've said? And have we got any kind of questions that you'd like to ask, or you'd like me to pick up on at that point? Is there anything really, if you kind of you're okay, and anything you'd like to just pop in the chat to comment on, or are we all okay? Natasha, you're harsh. Yes, I mean that quite often happens as well. It's what I said, it's a funny thing about the teacher hat and the examiner hat. Sometimes you, as a teacher, you're always looking just to make them better, whereas examiners are not. We're kind of accept that it's at the end. Gabriella, thank you. Good. Yes, yes, and I mean, I think keep in mind the idea that the what looks like generosity is to do with the fact, and particularly if we're talking about higher tier candidates, and if that's the majority of the candidates that you have, this task isn't designed to take them much beyond sort of grade 4, beginnings of grade 5, you see. So I think it's important just to kind of understand that there's a higher demand in that second writing task at higher tier. But anyway, good that people were reassured. But anyway, you've seen the standard exemplified, and I'm also pleased if you found it reassuring. So that's great. Thank you. Now, what we're going to do now is I'm going to see if we can drop you into in a moment into a, 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 a breakout room. But I'm going to give you now sort of 10 minutes or so. We'll pop you in a breakout room with 3 or 4 people. So you should get an opportunity to join and actually have a bit of a discussion. And we're going to get you to do the bit of unseen marking. So what we want you to do is to read exemplar number 3 now of the unmarked script. So this one won't have marks on for you. So there's, now we're kind of aiming to mark sort of blind, if you like. And then we'll just get you to say which marks you've got. We don't particularly need to use a poll or anything. We've got a small enough group that we can just do that through the chat, or we might get some people, if they're happy, to come on the mic and just talk us through what they found. So we want to know what you find for communication and content, and also what you find for linguistic knowledge and accuracy for exemplar number 3, please. And keep in mind those things that I said, that we're top box, quite good, and so on down. So find the box first, choose the box first, big picture first, and then have a think about the mark. So let's have a go, see if we can just see if we can, hopefully, if it works, drop everybody into a breakout room. So you should be invited into a breakout room with 2 or 3 other people. So let's have a go, and let's just do those. Okay, so here we go then, and we'll give you about 10 minutes. Hi there. I'm not sure how that worked, and I think apologies if you were somebody who ended up in the room on your own for a moment. Okay, thanks, Sylvia. No problem. Can we get a little bit of just sort of feedback on where you were with those marks? Sean, I can see you. I don't know if you're able to talk and just sort of feedback on behalf of the group that you were with.
Yes, so
Yeah,
we thought
great.
generally for the CC somewhere between 4, 5, 6, and for the LKA 3 or thereabouts.
Oh, right. Okay, that's interesting. And is anybody else able to Natasha, Scott, Susie, are you able, one of you able to come on and say where you went with your
Yeah, we agree completely with Sean. We actually went 6 and 3. We didn't feel that it was accurate enough. There were only one example of each tense that was accurate. There was quite a lot of repetition as well. We couldn't find very much in terms of those conjunctions and those linking ideas. So yeah, we generously gave a 6, I think, and agreed on the 3.
Well, actually, I mean, what I will say is that I think you from what we had from the principal examiner, you all came out quite harsh on that. So you'll be surprised, hopefully reassured, maybe to know that it came out with an 8 for communication and content and 5 for linguistic knowledge and accuracy. So keep in mind what we said about, sort of attaching a word to it for what is a piece of sort of grade 4 targeted writing. Keep in mind, you could count that as a reasonable attempt. It's reasonable. So what the principal examiner gave was 8 marks for communication and content and 5 for linguistic knowledge and accuracy. So what we're told is that the information was relevant to the task. If also, just to mention as well, although it looks quite short, if you count up, I counted the words, although we say to candidates, no, it's about 85 words, so it's sort of spot on for length. Information relevant to the task is communicated. There's an attempt to develop each key point, but it's not always clearly communicated. So there's a sort of problem really in that you can read it, but at times you're having to do a bit more work to understand. There's mostly effective adaptation of language and some effective, and there is some effective language that gives some personal opinions. And there's mainly common familiar language. So the bit that it particularly sort of misses out on really is the sort of unfamiliar, unusual elements of language there. Linguistic knowledge and accuracy then, so we've got some straightforward grammatical structures that are evident and sort of fairly solid, but there are some extended sentences that are linked with familiar straightforward conjunctions. So we've got we've got porque, we've got también occurs. Languages, I mean, it is frequently accurate. There are sort of extended sequences of accurate language, but sometimes only with some minor errors. We've got some references to past, present, and future events. Again, mostly successful, but just with occasional sort of bits of ambiguity. With en el semana pasado me visité un museo de dibujo con mis amigos para mi asignatura de dibujo. And so although there's quite a lot of, there are a number of errors there, not many of them actually prevent meaning being conveyed, and we do have that sort of extended sequence. So it's interesting that you all sort of said in the first session when you looked at them, you were sort of surprised that the marks were quite as high as they were. and that you were a little bit harsh. And I think you've been a little bit harsh, but you're kind of one box too harsh. Not worrying too much about the actual marks, but you tend to be sort of in the box below where you need to be. So that said, we're going to get you to have a go at another one now. So just kind of keep in mind that there is a bit of you've maybe been a little bit harsh with that. So we're looking for a little bit more generosity perhaps when we do exemplar number 4. And what we're going to get you to do with exemplar number 4, well, we've done our sort of reflections on exemplar 3. Does anybody have anything that they wanted to say about that exemplar number 3? Does it surprise you that it was quite as generous as it in your eyes as it was, or does it make sense? Okay, well, we'll move on. We're going to get you to do number 4 now. Now, I don't think we probably need 20 minutes because the passages the pieces are quite short, but we'll give it another 10 minutes and we'll pop you into 2 rooms this time. But what I want you to do really is a couple of things. So we're going to think about the marks first of all. So what marks are you going to give to exemplar number 4? And exemplar number 4 is slightly better, you will see, hopefully, than exemplar number 3, but same sort of ballpark. But what I'm particularly sort of interested in getting you to do is just to discuss in your group that, what would be the feedback that you would give to a student who produces that work? So that, what are the 3 positives, and then what are the 3 kind of key developmental pieces of feedback that you would like to give to that student to kind of lift that mark from where it is, lift the quality of it to perhaps the box above, or to kind of solidify the mark a little bit. So we're not looking for things which might be transformational for the student, but just in practical terms, what are you going to say? Look, actually, you did this bit's all really, this is good. You've done all those things well. Maybe you've covered all of the bullet points equally, and that's a really good feature. However, maybe we need to think about these other things. So if I give you about sort of 10 minutes, we'll pop you back into the rooms again in a moment, and we'll give you about 10 minutes then, and then we'll kind of come back together just to look at the marks and also just think about what feedback you might give. I think I'm going to pop you into 2 rooms this time instead of 3, so you might be with new people, but I think that will just make sure nobody ends up on their own. Okay, so we'll pop you into breakout rooms now. Hello, everybody back. That's good. So what I'm going to do, I will just sort of put you out of your misery in terms of where the marks sat for this one. So for communication and content, the candidate got 9, and for linguistic knowledge and accuracy, the candidate got 6. So I'm just interested if we could kind of get somebody maybe from each of the two groups who might be willing just to sort of give us a bit of feedback on kind of what you thought. Nancy, are you there? Are you able to talk? And
hello. Yes.
hello.
Hi.
Hi.
We were talking
What?
in the other group. So we thought we put 10 for the CC.
Yeah.
And 6 on the linguistic.
So very close. That was very close. Yeah.
And then when we look at those, what can we say? We saw that this student couldn't improve just by reading his work again, or his or her works again, because there is a repetition of words. For example, la, louve. So that simple thing should be just avoid that mistake there.
Yes. There are one or two things like I mean, I don't know whether you noticed, we've got el excursión, you know, so there are sort of things like that where just like reconsolidating the fact that those eon words ought to be feminine and things like that, isn't it? I think. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what the principal examiner said, and we'll hear from the other group as well in a moment, so that the information was relevant to the task, and that there's some development of each of the key points, but not always totally clear. Mostly effective adaptation of language. The candidate wrote in a slightly more controlled way, and you did notice 4 distinct paragraphs in this one, which again, you know, nobody says you absolutely have to paragraph, but in the previous one, if you remember, it was sort of a continuous text, but there's sort of organization here as well, which is a useful feature because it keeps them on track. Variety of mainly common familiar language, occasional uncommon bits of language. So we are seeing some more uncommon language here, because we hear Grecia, we've got novia, galerías, entretenido, they're trying to say Escocia, you know, those things that are not the first sort of line and most obvious bits. And then in terms of the linguistic knowledge and accuracy, you were spot on. I mean, you were very close in if you sort of 10 and 6, that's as no, if you were an examiner, the principal examiner would not change that mark. That would be within tolerance. But different examples of straightforward grammatical structures, some extended sentences as well that are linked with, you know, straightforward conjunctions, y, porque, so on. Quite a lot of accurate language and sort of references to past, present, and future events. Mostly successful, a little bit ambiguous occasionally. And there are only really a few sort of errors that actually hinder the clarity of the communication. But you're right, aren't you, that it's mainly to do with sort of proofreading and sharpening that up a little bit. And you could sort of see how that linguistic knowledge and accuracy could go up a mark, or possibly 2, if it didn't have the errors, it was a you know, the range of language and everything was probably there, wasn't it? So good. So from room 2, Marta, are you able to? Martha, are you there? Hello. Hiya.
Hi. Yeah, thank you. I am new on this, so that's why I listen more. But I was discussing with Susie, and I think we agree with the LKA, the 6 as well. But we dare to say the CC. I think it was 12. I don't remember. Susie, I don't know if you can help me. But I think we decided a bit higher because it's not. It's the student was using the verbs correctly. I mean, using at least 3 verbs there, and There is errors as well there, but I think he followed the bullet points, and it's quite specific because there is one paragraph for the present, another paragraph for the past, and for the future. So we consider he made very well. He can do better, of course.
Yes, I think the slight limitation is on the future tense bit, isn't it? It's sort of the first two paragraphs are really strong, but in future tense, just all we've got is I'd love to visit Scotland because it's pretty and I like mountains. So we haven't seen much sense of future, if you see what I mean. So I think that slightly limits the communication and content. But I mean, look, the principal examiner gave 9. I think you could, 10 would be, close enough as well. So I think it's probably that if the quality of the first two paragraphs had been sustained, then we would have been up sort of with the 11 or 12. But there isn't very much there with the future, really, I think. But anyway, yes, interesting. So what advice would you be giving, Marta, if you've got this student in your class, what are you going to tell them they need to, how are you going to help them?
Based on this example?
Yeah.
Well, go back and revise the future.
Yeah.
Because they are strong in the present tense. Maybe I make sure giving activities, extra writing activities using the past tense, and maybe I go back to revise the past tense and the future because they need to reinforce. They need to be more confident without managing or manipulating those tenses.
Yes.
So they can go further. Are we doing that?
Yes, absolutely. And I think also just encouraging them for sort of each of the bullet points to maybe have 3 different ideas, three distinct ideas, because in the future all we've got is the idea of going to Scotland. But maybe if we knew a little bit more about what they'd like to do in Scotland, and they've said why they want to go, but what they'd like to see and what they'd like to do, we could have just expanded those things out. So it's perhaps sort of just maybe expanding the range of ideas. And also it's the proofreading, isn't it? It's the sort of checking the accuracy for the sort of quality of language that candidate, because it's actually, if it were not for the errors, it would be the language would be great, wouldn't it, for what you'd expect for a sort of grade for middle crossover candidate.
Thank you. Interesting.
Great, thank you. Well, that's correct. Now look, we've sort of talked a bit about how you can support your students. I'm just going to say a few more things, and then we'll kind of open up. And if we've got any questions, anything people would like to raise or discuss, those of you who've stuck around to the end, we can do that, and then we can kind of wrap up comfortably in the next 5 minutes or so, hopefully. So I suppose, first of all, has anybody got anything they wanted to sort of raise or ask a question about? If you do, now is a good moment to do it.
Yes.
Yes, go on. Yes.
Yeah, that's my time. Thank you. As a new teacher, I asked to my head of the faculty to get the books for the students. I mean, revision books. But I heard there is a disagreement. They cannot get them. So I was wondering how to get them for them. No, because they are new GCSE they chose this year. So I think I'm gonna do, as I was talking with Susie as well, and now talking to you, the new marking or the new criteria. And some students I have higher, I can see they are very, very higher, very interested, very confident learning the Spanish language, but some of them they are lower. And now parents blame me. But I wanna really do more for them because it's not late. We are starting. So please, can you advise me something so I can improve or help them?
I mean, obviously we can't sort of say what the school will afford to pay for, and so I think you're probably going to need to be looking around for free materials. If you have a look on the Pearson website as well, what we have got is, and I think they're called clickable classroom materials. So on the website for the Spanish GCSE, the 2016 GCSE, we've got a lot of material that we took from the international specifications and we've transferred it over into the national. So from past papers for it. And I think that would give you some useful additional materials. Remember that there's a lot of stuff on the website. And you know, things sort of past exam papers are good, but these clickable classroom ones have got they've got listening and reading and things in them. So I think they would be quite a good source of extra material for revision, and there are classroom ideas in them as well. So I think those are quite a useful resource if you have a look. But you just need to have a look at teaching and learning resources on the website, and there is quite a lot there.
Okay.
And then from a point of view of sort of writing and speaking, some of it is about kind of working on some of those areas like the uncommon vocabulary to make sure that they've got a little repertoire of personal vocabulary that they can use. So as I mentioned, they don't always go to the park. They might go to the baseball ground or something. Or they don't always go to the beach. They could go on a city break or into the mountains. They don't always eat pizza. They could eat something else. And so I think some of those things are quick and easy ways to sort of just add that little bit of quality. You don't automatically make a student who's a sort of grade 4 student into a grade 8 or 9 student, but 1 or 2 grades sometimes, I think you're right, you can do something by kind of looking at where you can find sort of holes in what they're doing and target the mark schemes. Look very carefully at the mark schemes at where you think the gaps are. Do I help? I mean, it would be. I wish I could give you a more totally definitive answer, really.
Yes, because everything is good for me. You just to repeat, you say go to the clickable resources. You say that?
Yes, I think they're called clickable classroom resources. And let me just give me a moment. Let me just see if I could find.
Thank you. Because I've been told to go to the Active Hub, and students can get as well to the area at the same time.
Yes.
So, so there is a lot of things to learn. So I am on that way.
I'm just going to have a look if I could find.
Thank you.
Yes, I mean Active Learn will have it. I don't just find it here, but it is definitely on the website. So it's called. Let me put in the chat.
Thank you.
And it's called Clickable Classroom Resources. So if you look in the teaching and learning resources on the website, those are there, and they're quite nice because they're put together as a sort of something to teach in a lesson. So there's a sort of PowerPoint kind of ready to go with lesson ideas there. Okay.
Thank you.
If you look at all of you, if you're looking for resources for revision and you've exhausted all the past papers from the specification that we're doing, remember the Pearson International, the international GCSE as well, because although the format of the test is slightly different, they are very useful. You know, they're kind of good stuff.
International, okay.
Good. Right. Okay. So just a few things to sort of remind you of before we depart in a couple of minutes. You've got a subject advisor who is Rebecca Waker. And again, you can find through the website. Contact her, Martha, if you're struggling to find anything, and she will help you do that. So that you can do through the main website.
Okay.
You can follow also on, if you're a Facebook user, you can find Pearson Edexcel languages qualifications, and so there's an opportunity to sign up for that. And you'll have a copy of the PowerPoint, I think is in the download, so the links will be in it. You should be able to find. We'll mention also the Professional Development Academy. You can have a look at the Professional Development Academy, which has got all sorts of learning materials available there. We'll just mention as well that after the event today, you'll get a sort of a link to sort of share your feedback. So if you'd like to do that, that's a useful thing for us to kind of build events for the future. And really, from my point of view, we're right on the 6 o'clock deadline now. So I would say thank you very much for your time this afternoon. We do wish you every success. Have a look carefully at the mark schemes, go back over the materials that we've looked at this afternoon and sort of unpick it, because as soon as you can assess your own students effectively and you know where they are, that gives you, I think, the springboard to know how you move each one on individually a little bit. With that, I think I say gracias, and we'll see you all again, hopefully in the future. Thank you very much.